don't know that I would claim to be authority on it, but I very much enjoy Walter Scott's writing as part of a larger canon of Scottish literature. Walter Scott was such a tremendously successful author, novelist, poet, essayist, biographer, editor, that I really enjoy teaching him because I think he's extremely important. He wasn't as highly followed in the 20th century as he was in the 19th, but in the 19th century he was a huge literary rock star, basically. One of the things I've discovered, and others have as well, the phenomenon of the naming of towns in the United States, and actually throughout the world, after Walter Scott's Waverley novels. And that's something specific that I'm really interested in. He wrote a number of novels that became known as Waverley novels. The very first novel that Scott wrote, he published anonymously in 1814. It was called Waverley, or 'Tis 60 Years Since. He published it anonymously in part because he was extremely well known as a poet. He wrote Lady of the Lake and a variety of other poems that were very, very popular and highly regarded. When he turned to fiction, though, he had some qualms about whether or not probably he would be successful. And at the time, fiction didn't have as strong a reputation as did poetry. Published anonymously, as did many authors at the time, as did Jane Austen, who published at the same time. And so he wrote what was considered to be the very first historical novel, and that was Waverley. It was a huge success, and so then he thought, well, this worked very well. So he published his second novel a year later, 1815, Guy Mannering, and he decided to sign it by the author of Waverley, and so they became known as the Waverley novels. I started searching, why was Waverley, Iowa, named Waverley? It's spelled differently, and I guess I didn't understand the enormity of all of these places, towns throughout the world named Waverley. Some are named after specific Waverley novels, like Ivanhoe. But I started looking, there are Waverleys throughout the United States, but primarily in the area of the Midwest. And so I visited Waverleys in Waverly, Ohio, 2 in Indiana, Waverly, Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska. Nebraska actually named its streets after the characters and settings in the Waverley novel. It's a really interesting and somewhat a unique phenomenon in sort of the swath of Waverleys that exist in the Midwest. So I think that in and of itself is really quite interesting. And I don't know if you're familiar with the huge tower-like edifice in Edinburgh, sort of down by Waverley Station, named for the Waverley novels. It's a big train station in Edinburgh. But it was specifically built to commemorate Scott in the 1840s. And there's a statue of Walter Scott in Central Park in New York City. But the towns themselves are named after the literature. And I think there's a reason for that. That's the part that I want to find out more about. But part of it had to do with the enormous popularity of his novels. William Harmon named Waverly, Iowa, because he wanted the citizens to embody the generosity, honor that the novels espouse. So he wanted it to be sort of like these memorable characters in the novels. There's also a tremendous pirating of Scott's novels when they came over. So American publishers in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, they basically published them from an American publishing company, even though they were still the Waverley novels. They sort of became American in that very act. Literature is very central to this whole idea of memory making. So this is what she says. Central to the role of literature as a medium of collective memory making, I shall argue, is its ability to cross existing cultural borders and to provide an imaginative template for articulating values and defining identities. And that's one thing novels have a great tendency to do. They go from one place to another. They came from Scotland and Great Britain to the United States. Memory only became an issue, whether it's something to be cultivated or as a source of anxiety, when people started to see the present and future as systematically different from the past. And she says the key to his huge success was his forging of a potent alliance between fiction, memory, and identity. He had sort of highlighted, there were flashpoints of cultural peoples in the south, far north in the Shetland Islands, on the east coast, gypsies and smugglers, very interesting stories. The heart of Edinburgh, the home of enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, and urban Edinburgh. So he was able to capture all these different sorts of identities at particular times and bring them alive in a way that made sense to people who were settling in the United States. Okay, that's a great question. So why is he important to read now? Hail to the Chief, the music played when the President of the United States is inaugurated. Bum, bum, ba-dum.
Yeah.
The words Hail to the Chief hail from Scott's Lady of the Lake, the poetry, the poem.
Oh.
There are all sorts of ways in which actually our popular culture today and what we think of as being part of our culture now really stems from Scott. And the New York Times published an article in January of 2013 that said Walter Scott and Jane Austen were the two most influential authors of the last 2 centuries in terms of their styles and themes. Within the last 10 to 15 years, his reputation and the attention to his work by scholars has just jumped up enormously again, because I think he offers us ways to think about our present culture. He often talks about the clashes of different cultures, and he comes down in a way that recognizes the differences in culture. At the same time, he argues that there are ways in which they can actually coexist and move forward in a positive manner. He offers ways for people reading his stories to think about cultures, their differences, as well as their similarities and how they can move forward. And with Scotland seeking independence recently, there's been great attention to Scott as a voice for Scotland and the Scottish people, all the different peoples all over the nation of Scotland.